the Corruption Risk Mapping Research Report. I invite Jean Samuel, the Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka, to officially launch the report. And my colleagues will be distributing the reports to you right now.
Launches the Corruption Risk Mapping Research Study.
For those who are interested in diving deeper, a QR code is available on the screen as well. Simply scan it to access the report and explore its findings in detail. You can also visit www.tisrilanka.org/CRMR to view and download the report. Thank you, Jean. I hope you all received your copies. We now have Ms. Michelle Handy, the independent consultant, who will be walking us through the key findings of the corruption risk mapping research. Michelle, the platform is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. So let me first thank Transparency International for giving me the opportunity to conduct this research on their behalf and to present the findings for them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the findings of the report, and I'll be walking you through first the definition and methodology, then the alleged experiences of corruption in the private sector, the identified risk factors and mitigatory measures, and finally the recommendations that the report makes. At the very outset, let me first talk to you a little bit about the value of this report. And this report really contributes to the corruption narrative in two key ways. The first way is that it documents alleged experiences of corruption within the private sector, and it interestingly also highlights instances of private-to-private corruption, possibly for the first time in Sri Lanka. And while it doesn't cover all sectors of the private sector, it's not possible to cover the entirety of the private sector, it gives us key insights that we can use for further interventions and recommendations for the future. So looking at the methodology of the report, the research was conducted in 4 stages. The first was a comprehensive desk review. The second was key informant interviews with 29 stakeholders, and in conducting the informant interviews, we were conscious to speak to people who had knowledge of company operations and who were representative of various sectors, such as various chambers of commerce, experts in forensic auditing and corruption/anti-corruption, and as well as the demand and supply side. So we spoke not only to the private sector, but to certain public institutions as well. We also conducted 3 focus group discussions, and here again we were conscious of maintaining a cross-section of the private sector, particularly focusing at private sector entities from out of Colombo, from the districts, focusing on Jaffna, Trincomalee, and Galle. And finally, there was a validation meeting held to vet the findings of the research and finalize the findings. Before I move on into the findings of the research, there are 2 key limitations that I must mention. The first one was already touched upon by Nicole, and that is that research is limited in scope. It was not feasible to assess all private sector entities, as I'm sure everybody knows. And therefore, the information gathered cannot be extrapolated or assumed to be representative of the entire private sector. But as Nicole mentioned, it is a good starting point and a scoping of what the private sector issues are and what risk factors they do face. The second issue is that, the second limitation is that the narratives and the experiences narrated here are of course not findings of corruption in the private sector, but mere allegations of incidents and experiences of the respondents within the research. Therefore, all anecdotal evidence that is put forth in the report is, as I have mentioned, an allegation of corruption and not a finding of corruption in the private sector. Then moving on to the definition, one of the key challenges that we had at the very outset was understanding how to define corruption within the private sector. And this was because we realized very early on in the research that the understanding of corruption within the private sector was a little weak. So when we reached out to the private sector entities and spoke to them about corruption, the initial response was that there was no corruption in the private sector, that it was a largely public sector issue. For this reason, we adopted a broad definition, which is up on the screen. And the purpose of this was to cover so that certain practices within the private sector that were either unethical or perhaps were legal but could be seen as corrupt would be covered and would be encompassed within this definition. With that in mind, let us now move on to the key findings of this report. So the findings of the report are divided into two key sections. The first section narrates alleged experiences of corruption in the private sector, and the second section of the report addresses the risk factors of corruption in the private sector. So when we came to look at the alleged experiences, one of the most interesting findings was that corruption within the private sector was both coercive in nature and collusive in nature. When we talk about coercive corruption, what we refer to here is that it is the corruption or demand for money in exchange for the provision of services. It is therefore almost extortionary, and the private sector feels that they are forced to engage in this form of corruption. Therefore, we call it coercive corruption. But interestingly, one of the key findings of this report is that there is also a form of collusive corruption within the private sector. And collusive corruption really looks at two parties engaging together to engaging in corruption to benefit themselves or for their own private gain. And what this research found out was that the private sector was not only coerced into corruption, but also engaged in collusive corruption. The incidents of corruption, alleged corruption, that were disclosed throughout this research can be broadly divided into two. The first is when the private sector deals with the public sector, and then the second and more interesting findings were when the private sector deals with other private sector entities themselves. So looking at first, we'll look at the most common forms of alleged corruption when the private sector deals with the public sector. And this, we had several findings coming through. So the first one that was alleged was that the public sector engaged in delay tactics, which often led to the private sector feeling coerced to offer bribes and engage in corruption to obtain services. So these delay tactics could be, for example, the delaying of approvals, the delaying of licenses, and the delaying of, I beg your pardon, the intentional misplacing of files, all of which delay the approval process that the private sector has to engage in, and therefore causes an incredible cost to the private sector, which does have targets to meet, and therefore forces them to engage in some form of bribery or corruption. Another form of corruption that came up was in relation to misinvoicing, and this allegation was made particularly in relation to Sri Lanka Customs. Here, there were allegations that the harmonized code, which is the standardized nomenclature that is associated to all imports, being manipulated either to avoid taxation, to avoid duty, or to bring in restricted goods into the country, and to avoid the necessary licensing for those particular goods. These allegations also extended to the extent that companies engage in either undervaluing, understating, or misdescribing their imports for the purposes of evading tax and duties. So therefore, one of the key findings that the research came up was that there was several allegations of misinvoicing, particularly when dealing with the customs. On the other hand, then we also had allegations of bribes to avoid red tape. And I think this is fairly self-explanatory. We all know that there are several bureaucratic challenges when dealing with the public sector, and allegations were made that bribes were often offered to expedite these processes, or facilitation payments were made. Another allegation of corruption that was seen, especially in relation to the public sector, was in the form of tax evasion. This took two forms really. The first was the avoiding of paying of your everyday commercial taxes with the intention of further later on bribing the Inland Revenue Department in order to avoid the surcharges and the fees that would attach. On the other hand, there were also allegations of manufacturers of alcoholic beverages also trying to evade taxes. This came out quite consistently throughout the report, where it was said that the excise department has now introduced a new sticker system to ensure that all manufacturers pay taxes, and there have been allegations that certain manufacturers have now begun trying to forge these stickers with the intention of engaging in tax evasion. Another allegation of corruption that came to light was that there is an abuse of law, and this was particularly so highlighted in relation to the Inland Revenue Department. Here, what was highlighted was that the Tax Appeals Commission Act number 23 of 2011 allows a company to appeal a tax assessment that they have received. However, when they do appeal this tax assessment, they are required to deposit with the government 25% of the assessment. Allegations were made that certain Inland Revenue officers were cognizant of this provision and used it to provide falsified assessments with exorbitant rates, knowing that the companies would rather offer a bribe to avoid going through the tax appeals process, which would tie up a fairly large sum of their money for a fairly long period of time. Therefore, there were allegations that this particular law was abused for the purposes of soliciting bribes within the Inland Revenue Department. Finally, when dealing with the public sector, there were also allegations in relation to obtaining licenses and approvals. This came out particularly in relation to the excise department, where there were allegations that yearly liquor license renewals were often a challenge for companies in the hospitality industry. And it was interestingly noted that this was not just a challenge when dealing with the excise department, but it trickled down even to the local government authorities, where it came to getting approval for survey plans, because the regulation says that you cannot have a church or a place of religious worship or a school within the area of the liquor, the manufacturing process. And therefore, this showed that there was a trickling down of the bribery from the excise department right down to the local government authorities, and there were allegations of this as well. Another key allegation that almost all respondents mentioned was that there was a high risk of corruption when the private sector engaged in public procurement or when they bid on government contracts. And this too took several forms were highlighted. As with the other forms of corruption, this too could have been coercive and collusive. And one of the most commonest forms that was alleged was bribery. And this, it was highlighted, could be bribery to win the contract, bribery to then, once you have won the contract, to have the payments released, and therefore the entire process from the point of tendering right up to the implementation of the contract had a cycle of bribery right throughout. There were also allegations that oftentimes government contracts, the bid documents and the request for proposals were manipulated to suit a particular supplier. This was done in two ways. Either the technical specifications in the bid documents were so specific that it applied only for one particular supplier, or it was so vague that it could be later manipulated to exclude the supplier that was not the preferred party. Then moving on, there were also allegations that sometimes the technical committees, the technical evaluation committees, were either reconvened when the preferred supplier was not selected. So if a particular supplier who was the preferred candidate was not selected, there were allegations that these committees were either reconvened, revised, and restructured to ensure that the evaluation committee would then select the preferred supplier. And as with the previous slide, there was, of course, the mention of bribery to overcome bureaucratic inefficiency and red tape. And finally, there were allegations of favoritism, where it was indicated, especially in the pharmaceutical industry, that payments for pharmaceuticals, which are currently on a backlog due to the economic crisis, often went to the suppliers who were the most, who had the favoritism of the, who were the favored suppliers. These allegations were key in terms of public procurement and how the private sector engaged with government contracts. Next, we look at the causes of corruption when dealing with the public sector, and there were allegations that the opaque and complex systems of the government, different public institutions, encourage corruption. And there were allegations that sometimes this opacity was maintained for the purpose of promoting corruption within these institutions. Another claim that was made was that there were no clear lines of communication. Oftentimes, there would be new policies or new regulations introduced which were not clearly communicated to the private sector, which meant that when they approached the public institution, they were often didn't have the correct documentation or the correct approvals, and therefore create space for corruption to occur. It was also alleged that senior officials in public institutions often have their hands tied because when they were juniors, they had themselves engaged in corruption and therefore now struggle to enforce the rule of law. Finally, the archaic laws of some of these public institutions was also highlighted. Particular attention was drawn to the customs ordinance, where it was alleged that customs officers used certain provisions of the customs ordinance to detain shipments and enforce arbitrary penalties on the private sector. The lax enforcement of regulation was also highlighted as a cause for corruption when dealing with the public sector, and this was seen particularly in relation to excise, where certain hospitality entities remain outside the regulatory framework of the excise department with little to no consequence. And finally, the eroded trust in public institutions was highlighted, where it was stated time and time again that companies would be willing to pay taxes, would be willing to pay the right import duty if they had a guarantee that the money would be put to beneficial use, and if they could be guaranteed a level playing field. So these were some of the key causes that were highlighted for corruption when dealing with the public sector. Now we move on to private corruption. And this was an interesting finding of this report, and I think for the first time sets out the possibility, the extent and an understanding of what private corruption between two private entities look like. So speaking to the respondents from the finance sector, there were allegations of fraud, where salespersons and employees defrauded their own company, often giving loans or collecting loans and then using it for their own personal gain. There were instances of companies using forged bank guarantees to apply for government contracts on the strength of those guarantees. And there was also allegations of favoritism, especially in the banking sector, where loans were given to the preferred party rather than based on the merit of the person's application. In the hospitality sector, there were allegations of kickbacks. This was particularly so in terms of tour agents who function on very high commissions. There was also allegations of favoritism during the procurement process, and which was circumvented was through the manipulation of the procurement process. The import and export sector also had allegations of offering gifts and hospitality. This could include sponsoring clients for overseas conferences and training programs, or the expectation of kickbacks, where importers, once they import a particular product into the company, would then visit the importer's showroom and take their pick of the goods as a form of kickback. There was also a very interesting allegation of importers creating monopolies for their own gain. And here it was said that certain importers may collude with customs officers to detain their competitors' imports so that their product is the only one that enters the market during times of seasonal demand. And once the seasonal demand decreases, They then collude with the customs officers again to have the detained competitors' products released into the market, at which point it is merely inventory for the competitor, who has also had to pay a high degree, an amount of demurrage. Looking at the insurance sector, as with the finance sector, there was always the risk of fraud. It was highlighted that sometimes hospitals, or it was alleged that sometimes hospitals manipulate the bills to provide higher insurance payouts, or that even customers themselves may engage in frauds with garages, where if they want their car repainted, they'll go and have a condemned part fixed to the car and then claim for insurance. And then we come to the pharmaceutical sector, which I'm sure none of us are strangers to, which everyone seemed to allege had a high degree of corruption within it. This often took the form of gratification and gifts and hospitality. And here again, it could range from overseas trips for doctors to paying for their children's education, or allegations of paying for even their children's weddings. There were also allegations of laboratories colluding with doctors to agree upon a commission that would be paid to doctors for every single test that is referred to them by that particular doctor. Some of the more general forms of private-to-private corruption that came up was in relation to procurement. So this was, as previously discussed, the expectation of kickbacks by procurement teams and favoritism in deciding the suppliers outside of the standard procurement processes. There was also claims of gratification and favors, and this was the standard hamper culture, which I'm sure we're all engaging in this coming season, and the wining and dining of clients and customers. There was also, interestingly, several human resources related corruption that was mentioned. There were allegations of favoritism at the point of recruitment and promotion, and there was also allegations of nepotism at the point of recruitment and promotion, where family members were preferred. Sometimes boards consisted largely of interconnected family members. And finally, there were allegations of the private sector engaging in lobbying. And this was to gain either a competitive advantage in government contracts, or to access or to influence government policy. This could also take the form of campaign financing, where certain companies may contribute to either particular politicians or political parties' election campaigns with the expectation of certain benefits at a later point in time. Another very interesting finding of this research was that there was an interconnection drawn between gender and corruption in the private sector. The first is, as believe Nicole mentioned, and also we saw in that video, was that there is an expectation of sexual favors from certain female employees in exchange for them receiving promotions or recruitment. There was also a lack of faith highlighted by female employees within the system, because the process when you raise these concerns was to have an HR inquiry and notify the perpetrator of sexual harassment with no termination or other further disciplinary action, and this often places the victim at a much more vulnerable situation. Interestingly, this research also highlighted that in certain sectors, men were also targets of sexual harassment within the private sector and were vulnerable to these forms of corruption. Finally, the research also highlighted that female entrepreneurs were at the risk of particular risk of sexual harassment, because they had to deal with a lot of red tape in setting up their companies. Their companies were new and didn't have protective policies in place, and therefore they were at a higher risk. So having gone through the alleged forms of corruption that do occur in the private sector, let us now look at the risks that have contributed to corruption within the private sector. The first risk that came up constantly was the allegation of the inadequate implementation of the regulatory framework. This was seen as the weak enforcement of law, where it was highlighted that some of the laws were limited in scope. For instance, the listing rules applied to the listed companies, but not necessarily beyond. The financial and reporting standards apply to specific business entities, but not to the entirety of the private sector. And therefore, there was a claim that the inadequate implementation of the law created a risk for private sector corruption. There was also a higher risk identified when the private sector engages with the public sector. And as we've already discussed, this usually was a result of ineffective engagement with the public sector, the deliberate maintenance of opaque communication lines, and the refusal or the lack of political will to adopt anti-corruption measures such as digitalization. It was alleged that some institutes had digitized their processes but still asked for physical copies, with the assumption that this was done to facilitate certain forms of corruption. Another key risk that fostered or created a space for corruption to occur was if there was no regulatory authority in a particular sector, or if there was a weak regulator. In industries with strong regulators said that there was a less likelihood of corruption occurring and a lower risk of corruption. However, if the regulator themselves were seen to be corrupt, or if there was no regulator at all, there was a higher risk of those industries being susceptible to corruption. The unequal playing field was also noted as a key risk of corruption. And here it was highlighted that once companies engage in corruption, it creates an unequal playing field, and therefore, in order to remain competitive in a corrupt market where there is systemic corruption, companies often felt coerced into engaging in corruption. Another risk that was highlighted was weak corporate governance practices. This was internal to companies, and these risks were related often to the setting of the tone at the top, where if the senior management was willing to turn a blind eye to corruption, this often would create a higher risk for corruption in those companies. Similarly, if it was a company that placed undue budgetary pressure on their employees, if remuneration was linked to targets and the achievement of targets, this often created a risk of corruption. Lacks organizational transparency, the use of opaque company structures, the unclear beneficial ownership of companies also created a high risk of corruption. And similarly, weak internal controls, where there were not enough adequate audit controls or there aren't any strong procurement processes, create a risk of corruption within the company. And then finally, it was highlighted that the high cost of implementing anti-corruption measures was yet another risk that often resulted in corruption. Another issue was highlighted as a risk for corruption is the unconducive business environment. And here it was highlighted that the unpredictability of the business environment due to the existence of corruption often led to companies engaging in corruption. It was also a challenge for startup companies that often rely on, due to the sort of nascent stage of Sri Lanka's venture capital market and angel investments, often rely on debt financing, and it was highlighted that there isn't a conducive environment for such companies to engage in debt financing unless they engage in some form of corruption. Several socio-cultural and economic factors were also indicated. It was highlighted that it is now accepted almost as a norm, as a way of doing business, that corruption is accepted as a way of doing business. It was also highlighted that due to the economic hardships, that sometimes corruption is resorted to more as a measure of desperation rather than due to a lack of integrity. And it was also highlighted that sometimes there's a general tendency for the private sector to presume that they are not corrupt due to a lack of knowledge on what may actually constitute corruption. Finally, informality was also highlighted as a risk of corruption. And this was highlighted where some companies prefer to remain in the informal sector and therefore outside the reach of their regulatory authorities, or it could be a matter of so that they could also continue in using their informal governance structures, and that this often created opportunities for corruption but also relied on corruption for its perpetuation. Finally, we come to some mitigatory measures. We've discussed the risk factors. Now, this research also looked at what mitigatory measures could be adopted to address corruption in the private sector. And there was few key mitigatory measures that were brought forward. The first was the adoption of codes of conduct and a zero tolerance approach to corruption. It was highlighted particularly that companies that had overseas parent companies or overseas principals had a higher standard of internal control and had generally adopted codes of conduct and a zero tolerance approach for fear of losing their overseas market. Similarly, companies that were listed on foreign stock exchanges were also more likely to have adopted higher standards of corporate governance and anti-corruption measures. The adoption of strong internal policies was also seen as a mitigatory measure that companies are now beginning to take to address the risk of corruption. Some of these could be the implementation of strong monitoring systems and adequate checks and balances, multiple levels of approvals, and even something as simple as a call center to call and verify whether a particular supplier, agent, or customer did in fact exist, and whether the numbers did in fact add up. It was recommended that companies adopt strong procurement policies, and that there should be a balance between the social and governance concerns and profitability instead of focusing solely on the bottom line. And finally, there are several chambers of commerce that have taken very encouraging steps towards addressing corruption. And some of these steps include the adoption of voluntary codes of conduct for their members, the introduction of ethical trading certificates for their members, and they've also begun engaging in advocacy and lobbying with certain public sector institutions, where they raise awareness amongst them about the impact of corruption or represent the grievances of their members to these particular public institutions. They have also begun engaging in awareness raising for their members, particularly on the harmful impact of corruption. Finally, looking at some of the recommendations that the report makes, we see, in particular reference to the companies, one of the key recommendations is the introduction of strong internal compliance measures, particularly the introduction of anti-bribery and corruption policies, whistleblowing policies, which include anonymous and confidential whistleblowing, the independent audit functions, the strengthening of independent audit functions, and procurement controls, including supplier audits and social performance audits. The second recommendation is to strengthen the corporate culture, and this is to set the tone from the top that a zero-tolerance approach to corruption must be adopted, and that corruption within the business operations will not be tolerated. The third recommendation is that there should be regular training on anti-bribery and corruption, and this should be ongoing at the point of induction and regularly reviewed and updated. And the final recommendation is for sector-wise companies to engage in collective action, where collective action is described as a collaborative and sustained process of cooperation between stakeholders. It assumes that all companies within a particular sector will say no to corruption and thereby equalize the playing field. And sectors that have adopted such a collective approach have seen remarkable strides in addressing corruption in their sectors. The final set of recommendations are made to the government, where it is recommended that the regulatory authorities should be strengthened, where there should be mandatory licensing in particular industries such as perhaps pharmaceuticals, and that the supervisory roles of the regulators should be further strengthened to monitor and regulate the private sector. It is also recommended that the public sector engage in digitization of their processes as well as digitalization of their processes to reduce human interaction and the risk of corruption. And finally, it was also recommended that government sector entities themselves should adopt transparent procedures and practices within their ranks to further strengthen their commitment to anti-corruption. So these are some of the recommendations that the report makes. And with that, I will close my presentation of the findings. If there are any further questions or clarifications, I would be happy to answer them.